Okay, welcome back. This is part 4. I keep wanting to give this series a title, but we haven't thought of that yet. So part 4 of Olly and Lydia talk about languages.
Or best language learning tips, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, tips and tricks for learning a language with Olly and Lydia. Mostly with Lydia, though. I'm just nodding. So this is part 4 of 5. In part 1, we covered the importance of the attitude and the mindset you bring to learning. Sounds woo-woo, but actually is extremely important, and without that, everything else fails. In part 2, we talked about prioritizing time and prioritizing. Part 3, we talked about the actual mechanics of learning. What do you do to learn the language? And then in part 3, we're talking, part 4 now, we're getting onto everybody's favorite topic, which is speaking.
Right.
So how do you see speaking fitting into the context of learning a language, Lydia? Do we start speaking from the beginning? And if not, when do we start? How much do we speak? Should we even speak?
So how do I see it? I see it as the most important part of it all, because this is usually the goal for people, as we've mentioned, right? People want to be able to speak fluently, but they don't really realize that this is the last thing they do. When they look at the things they do in their language learning, then speaking is usually not given as much time. But I believe it really needs to have a lot of time on your language learning agenda, because otherwise you will not improve in your speaking. You will improve in your vocabulary, comprehension, grammar, but not speaking. So however you learn, whatever methods you use, you just really need to make sure that speaking is a huge part of it. And as we touched upon that, I'm not a big fan of speaking from the very, very beginning, just because I like to have some, if we're learning a language from the beginning, from the start, I like to have some content, some input before that. So before I start speaking. And if we're speaking about people who have some passive knowledge of the language and want to activate it, then I really recommend starting with intensive listening and reading for, let's say, a month, and then start with an intensive plan to speak, and speak a lot, right? How do you feel about it? What's your? I think we didn't get to answer that question from your point of view. Speaking from the beginning.
Speaking from the beginning, yeah. So I don't do it. I mean, to give my Italian project, to use that as an example. I mean, what I wanted to test in this project was how much can I learn actually without speaking at all, just from reading and listening. So I gave myself a speaking ban.
That's cool.
For the first month, no speaking. I didn't speak a word. I really wanted to, actually, but I didn't. And I found that actually it was great, because when I did come to speak, there was much less of the struggle that you're often associated with speaking. So, I spent a month intensively reading and listening, exactly what you said, and then started to speak from month 2, and the process was much faster after that, because I just had that knowledge in my brain. And having said that, I think it's worth considering why speaking from the very beginning is often given as advice. And when you speak to people, kind of casual language learners who have maybe learned one other language and they just love it, they're super happy with it, it's changed their life, they've had a wonderful experience. Often people in that situation will say, speak from day one. And I think that advice comes from a good place, because one of the big dangers of anyone learning a language is that they never actually start speaking at all. And it's a huge danger, happens to so many people. And so one way to avoid that danger is to say, look, let's not let speaking turn into a huge beast that you have to slay, a huge source of fear and anxiety, which it does for people. Let's not let that happen. And to avoid that, we're going to go straight in and start from the beginning, speak from the first ever lesson.
Right.
I understand why that can be useful for people, and I used to do that myself as well. So I think if someone feels that that's the right thing for them to do, I think it's okay. But in terms of efficiency and actually, charting an effective progress through the learning process, I think it doesn't really help, because let's face it, on day one you have nothing to say. You know a few. So what's the point?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think you put it very nice. Like, this is a very good summary of the whole when to start speaking. So I agree. If it is one of the two extremes, like wait till you are ready to speak or speak right away without waiting, then definitely it's the second one, without any doubt. But as you say, yeah, it's some material to speaking. I also had this experience. I use it in Swahili and before with, Esperanto, Polish, Russian, other languages that I learned. If I waited just a little bit, but I knew that I'm going to force myself to start speaking when I don't feel ready yet. And this is a very important point. So you need to give it, let's say you give it 1 month or maybe 2 months. It doesn't really matter how much it is, but it needs to be not too long. So it shouldn't be like half a year or a year. That's definitely not a good way to start speaking.
I guess it must depend on the language somewhat, though, right? Because if you're learning Chinese or something, like a very different language from the perspective of an English speaker, I mean, in Italian, for example, I could start speaking quite soon because, linguistically it's quite close to English. But I could understand how with Chinese you might want to wait a little longer. But yeah, 6 months does sound like a long time to be learning a language without actually speaking. Because, how do you stay? Personally, I find this. I need speaking. Speaking is ultimately what motivates me the most. So I kind of feel like I need that fairly early on in the process.
I think there is a way how to start speaking with very little vocabulary, but it does include a lot of translation. And I know some people are not big fans of that. They say, "Oh, I just want to learn a language without using my mother tongue." I personally think that's nonsense, and it just means you will learn for a lot longer because when you use translation, meaning, let's say the tutor, it doesn't have to be a tutor, but the person you're speaking to, practicing with you, knows your language. Well, let's say English, right? And so you can start speaking with very little vocabulary by just asking or trying to answer some simple questions using a lot of English at the beginning. So if the teacher asks you, where are you living? And you say, how do I say live? And you ask him, how do I say live? And he says, you say it like this and that. You repeat it, and then you say, I live in Bratislava. So you have just learned the word which you needed for the conversation by asking for it in the language which is common to you and the tutor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also that can be, I've had experiences with languages where there are very few materials and resources where that is actually the only way to go about learning. So
right.
Egyptian Arabic, when I learned that when I was living in Egypt, there's basically nothing available for that language. And the only things that are usable or that are any good are written entirely in Arabic for the use of teachers. So as a self-studier, I had nothing, literally. So the only way I could get into the language was to sit with my tutor, Sada, in a cafe in Cairo and basically say to her, how do I say my name is Olly? How do I say where do I live? Like that was lesson one. It was like, or session one, I guess. It was literally just that. And so for languages without good resources, I mean, it may well be that that's your only way in, right? But we're talking about the exceptions here rather than.
I think this method is usable for any language, and this is maybe the mindset that people should have when they say practice speaking. Because for many people who don't have the experience, they think that when you have a lesson with a tutor, you're supposed to give full sentences and they should be grammatically correct, and you have a conversation. But when I look back at my first Swahili lessons, which were about 1 month or 2 months after I started learning it by myself, they were a lot of English. There was just, how do I say this? How do I say that? Why is it in this form? And I didn't understand the grammar, obviously. So I was just repeating these things and trying to repeat them as often as possible in order to learn them. But it helped me a lot that I had spent 2 months learning Swahili before, because I did have to ask for, how do I say I? How do I say live? How do I say Bratislava? And why, like, how do I say the grammar of this sentence, right? I already knew.
Did you find you had lots of resources for Swahili, self-study resources?
Not really. I mean, it's actually a surprisingly big language. It has about 80 to 100 million speakers.
Wow.
But it's the second biggest language in Africa. I had no clue about that before I started. But there are some materials, but not too many. And I haven't looked for authentic materials yet. I'm getting to a B1 level now. I think I'm on a B1 level now. So I will start looking for those materials now with small prints or books like that, which probably were translated into Swahili. But it's not one of those languages. Like, for example, Assimil only has it into French, not into English. So if you are an English speaker, you might struggle with some of those materials.
It is an interesting issue. I think this raises questions for classroom teachers as well, you know, like when's the appropriate time to start speaking? Because again, like the expectation from a lot of students going into a language class is that we will speak. And if they, I mean, how many times have you heard someone complain, you know, I went to a language class, we sat there for 90 minutes and I didn't say anything. We didn't speak. But why is that necessarily a problem? You know, why, you know, maybe it could be the case that you're learning tons of stuff. Like why is there like automatically an assumption that if you kind of sit there parroting stuff and drilling things, that's actually gonna be beneficial for you? I think a lot of approaches to classroom teaching do take this view of, okay, let's get students speaking from the start. So I'm going to teach you the structure of the present perfect using a rule on the board, and then I expect you to take that grammar point and start speaking using that grammar point right away. And that's always struck me as like, it gives you the illusion of learning, gives you the illusion of making progress. But it is really just an illusion because you've got no depth there. You're just kind of parroting stuff that you've heard or using your brain to construct a grammar rule. I think there's a very big case to be made for actually just not speaking at all in class. But the trouble is, like, what do students expect to speak? You know, that's the expectations. It comes back to the first part of this conversation, doesn't it? That the kind of mindset and the attitude. It's like the best teacher in the world is only as good as his worst student.
Yeah. As for the speaking in the lesson, I think it depends a lot on what is the other activity that you did instead of the speaking. Because a lot of lessons, I think, are wasted because the teacher speaks too much and the student thinks, oh, at least I'm getting some input. But I think this is actually wasting the time and the money, because you can get so much input from listening outside of the lesson for free, right? I mean, podcast series, we named a few of those. So I would say the goal is to speak, but as you said, it should have some depth. So I think a problem often is artificial situations, right? Your student A, your student B, you're lost at a train station, you give them directions, and it's all such an artificial situation where I think, I say it like this, my brain says, hey, but I'm not lost in the train station. I don't need to know if I should go right and then left and then straight. Like it's all very artificial, right? What I prefer to have is get to speak to native speakers as much as possible and get into these situations for real, like really try to help someone who is asking me for help. You know, but that means, of course, being in touch with native speakers also in real life, and not just having italki sessions, which is, of course, impossible for some people. But yeah, anyway, that's a wider topic.
Yes, yeah. I mean, this is again a huge-long conversation.
Yes.
All right, so we've talked about the ethos of speaking and when is the right time to start speaking. How about a few practical ideas here, because you know, speaking, what does it mean? How do you practice speaking? How do you get better at it?
So I would suggest, if someone is really scared of the idea of just getting a tutor and talk to them right away, and he is a native speaker, you know, and it's super stressful, then I suggest go through self-talk before that. Self-talk basically means you talk to yourself, but you do it in a structured way. So let's say you want to tell yourself what your day was like and what you had for breakfast and what you will do tomorrow or at the weekend, and you try to simplify as much as you can. You open a dictionary or a Google Translate or something, and you look for the words which you were missing. So if you say, okay, so today I woke up, how do I say wake up, right? And it's a word you want to use, so you look it up, and then you use it again, and you say, okay, I woke up, and then I had breakfast. I didn't go to work because I was ill, etc., etc. So you basically practice with yourself. And I know it sounds weird for many people, but I think this is a wonderful practice, because you are forced to actually give some output, to like speak, you know, to pronounce the words, look for them in your brain. So it's pretty difficult. I mean, it strains your brain a lot, but it gives you the necessary practice that you need maybe before the lesson with a native speaker.
Yeah, especially as well if you can't be speaking, right? It gives you a way to do something, to retrieve that information from your brain.
Exactly. Yeah, just very, very simple terms, and practice what maybe the native speaker will ask you, tell me who you are, where you're from, how long have you been learning this language, etc. You can easily prepare for that. So that would be one tip, I would say. The second thing is people often look for native speakers thinking they are the best teachers or professional teachers, if they have a certificate. And I'm not saying they are not good, but there are so many other people you can practice with who can be of the same service to you. I don't think that, especially on a level up to B2, I don't think it's particularly important that the other person is a native speaker. Like, of course, it's always good, and of course, it helps to hear the accent, etc. And you are sure that the native speaker understood you, so other people would understand you as well. But I am a big fan of two people practicing together, even if they are both students of the language. Even if they are both on, let's say, lower levels, and they cannot give each other a lot of feedback or correct each other's mistakes, but they still get to practice a lot. So and this is so easy because you can easily find students who are learning the same language as you are. And if you just agree that you will meet systematically online or offline and practice speaking, then that makes it super easy, right? Just to practice a lot, because again, as I said, it's fun, a lot of contact, effective methods and systems. So you need a lot of contact, and if you don't want to speak to yourself, you can speak to someone else. You don't need to worry about getting valuable feedback, because people don't really listen to the feedback anyway. I mean, I don't know what's your experience, but if you're trying to speak in a language which you're struggling with and someone keeps correcting you all the time, you won't probably remember it, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's different experiences, right? I mean, given the choice between practicing speaking with a native speaker or another student, I would probably choose the native speaker, right? But
if you can, sure.
You can, but often you can't. And so yeah, having opportunity to actually, if your aim is to practice speaking, to practice output, then anyone is great, because it's just the process is going on inside your brain, right? You're challenging yourself and your brain to actually get stuff out there. It's different though, isn't it? I guess it's important to point out that, and yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I interpret what you're saying, it's important to point out that you're not saying that, say, a group class with lots of other learners is okay to be your main source of input. Mm-hmm. That's a different thing, isn't it? You're talking specifically here about output and the opportunity to practice speaking.
Yeah, and also, of course, if I can choose, I will also opt for a native speaker if I can. But for many people, this is a big struggle, because first, they don't know where they can find native speakers to talk to, or then they don't want to pay money for the lessons. But if you find another student, you can have it for free because you're both motivated to practice. So I think this is a big argument for many people.
Yeah. So what are the benefits then of what are some of the benefits of speaking with other students?
Well, both of you are motivated, so it's not just you trying to ask someone to spend time with you. The other person is practicing at the same time, so you're both gaining from the experience. And and maybe you're a little less stressed because the other person is not judging you or anything. They make some mistakes and you make some mistakes, and maybe you can help them with something and they can help you with something. So I think it's more relaxed. This is the experience I have with the people I work with, that when they find someone that is as eager to improve the language, then they can share this whole journey. It's like, oh, I watched this really interesting TV series yesterday and this episode, etc., etc. So the other person understands because they're also learning the language. And I think this is something that often actually lacks with native speakers, because if that native speaker is not really learning any other language, then they cannot really understand the process you're going through, right?
Yeah, they can correct you maybe, but they might not be able to tell you why. What you're saying
as well. Yeah.
So what about mistakes? Because mistakes are obviously, when we speak, we don't like to make mistakes. They make us feel foolish. They slow us down. They frustrate us because we forget the things that we've been studying. How do you think about making mistakes when speaking?
This is, again, something which people just need to change in their mindset. really. And this is, I think, the biggest difference between experienced language learners and beginner language learners, because beginner language learners worry about mistakes far too much. And I think it just takes a little bit of personal experience where you realize nothing really happens when you make a mistake. Actually, what happens is that you learn from it. So trying to wait till you're perfect in the language doesn't make any sense at all. Instead, this is really the only way to get there is through mistakes, and that's how it works. So I think what it takes is for people to realize this is okay, this is part of the process, and this is not, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Like this is how it's supposed to be. So and then you don't.
I love that. It's not a bug, it's a feature. That's brilliant.
Right. Yeah. And so you stop worrying about it, and you take it as a game. You go like, if you get into this state of mind where you're playful with it, it's like, I want to tell you that I will go there tomorrow, and you are trying to make future tense, let's say, and you are guessing how it could be, and you just guess, like, because you've had some input before, you just make a guess, and then you wait for let's say, the tutor to correct you or see the reaction to that. So I think that helps a lot.
It's also worth recognizing that this is kind of, it's easy to make the assumption that if, let's say you make a mistake, right? Let's say you make a mistake in English and I point that mistake out to you. Chances are you're not going to remember that correction anyway.
Yeah.
Often when someone corrects me, I'm like, oh, okay. In the moment, it's great. And I feel like I've learned.
Mm-hmm.
But almost certainly I'll make that same mistake 5 minutes later.
Exactly.
Like that is the experience of learning.
And that is why I always ask my tutors to write down my mistakes. So when I have my italki session, we always have a Google Sheet open. And whenever I make a mistake, my tutor writes it down with the English translation.
So my tutor do that as well, but I'm too lazy to ever go back and review the notes. That's the thing. You get those lists of corrections, you've got to make sure then that you actually go back and review them, right?
No, there needs to be a systematic way about that, because otherwise you'll never get to it.
Yeah, so that's the point where I really often fall down, because I just I don't know, as time goes on, I like less and less doing any activity that's not completely natural. Content and stuff.
I know. But in my case, for example, I'm on line 750 right now with my Swahili, but I have put 560 of those words into my gold list method, which is a method for learning vocabulary I use. I just put them into a notebook and rewrite them every 2 weeks. It's a wonderful method. And so every day I know it's part of my system. When I wake up, I first do my gold listing. I know I need to create a new list of 20 expressions. So I just open this list, and it's wonderful because it's already there. It's the words which I missed when I was speaking before with my tutor, and I just rewrite them into the vocabulary, like 20 at a time, and then move on. So that's the system, right? I think I also struggled with this with many languages, but right now I have a system for processing that vocabulary.
Yeah, the closest I've come to a system that really works for me is to run my list of notes through a filter. So if I speak Italian for an hour with my tutor and I have a list of 100 corrections that he's made or something, which is pretty normal.
Yeah.
If I'm doing what I should do, because I know it works, is at the end I'll take the time to go back through that list, choose the stuff I think is really important, maybe 5, 10, 15 things, and then do something with that with those points, right? And I like to use flashcards because I like how it stays organized. So I can kind of copy them into my flashcards. So through choosing just the most important stuff, I'm kind of being keeping it manageable. Like so, it's like, okay, it's 10 things. Oh, I can do that.
Right.
But if I try to learn everything, it's just impossible.
Definitely.
That's the closest I've come to like that. It's a system that isn't totally overwhelming. Because otherwise you just have these long lists of stuff that you never go back to, right? And it's just such a kind of waste of everybody's effort.
And when it gets too big, it's scary. Like you don't want to really do anything with it because it's too much. And that's why I have this 20 expressions a day into my new list, and that's manageable. I'm catching up with my line 751.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So you've talked about self-talk. You've talked about output.
Yeah.
And how you can learn from actually speaking yourself, and how you can do that with lots of different people, but not making mistakes. What do you actually talk about then when you get to speak?
Well, this is the problem for many people. Like the first 1 or 2 lessons are interesting because you learn about each other, right? And what do you do, etc. But then it gets kind of boring because you know all about the other person. So if you have like a study tutor or a conversation partner, that can be a problem. And
Do you have that problem personally?
What that I don't know what to talk about?
Yeah.
Not really. I mean, I can always dig into stuff, and I'm good at creating content that I can talk about. So my teacher just asked me, "How was your day?" and I will come up with this story, you know, which I try to say, etc. But I think many people do. It's like
I've noticed that many people do. The reason I ask is because I've never had a problem with that. If I have a conversation partner who I like, and who I get on with, I never seem to run. I mean, sometimes you have a slow conversation day, you know, but I generally never really run out of things to talk about. So
yeah, but it depends a lot on conversation.
But I appreciate people do, though. You know, I appreciate people do struggle with that.
But I have a very simple solution for people who do have a problem with that, who are maybe not so conversationally skilled, or you know they don't know how to lead the conversation in a way to continue. There's amazing websites, and I will just give like one of them, which I like using a lot. It's called ESL Discussionsorg. Have you heard about it?
No.
It's pretty cool because it gives you like 200 topics with particular suggestions of what to talk about and how to talk about it. So if you just look at, actually, let me see it right now, this ESL Discussions.org. What? No, not .com, sorry.
ESL standing for?
Sorry, ESL, like English conversation questions. I don't know what ESL stands for.
English as a second language.
Oh, right, sure. Okay, I know this EFL, right, as a foreign language.
There's like 10 different variations.
Right, okay. So you have 709 discussions, and each of these topics has like tens, you know, like let's say the topic babies, and then student A has 10 questions and student B has 10 questions. And just to give an example, what do you think of babies? Are you good with babies? What do you think babies like doing the most? And there's so many topics that it's very simple to answer this question, but it's wonderful for language practice. Really, really amazing.
Awesome. I mean, you mentioned questions there. I think one of the things I was going to say was that actually learning to ask questions yourself is a huge thing, because often I think people wait for the tutor to come up to do all the work and to come up with the topics, but actually being a good conversation partner means listening and then asking questions. And so you know, forcing yourself to ask more questions is often a very good way to extend the conversation.
Right, but there's a danger if the tutor is not aware of the goal of the lesson making you speak, then they may just go on and on and on and speak, and you just get listening practice, right?
Yeah. All right, so any final words on the topic of speaking?
Yes, maybe one final word, which I find very important, and that the key really to speaking at any level is to simplify whatever you want to say. Simplify it to the most primitive way how to describe things. And by that, I mean, my favorite example is when I try to explain to my Spanish students, Spanish-speaking friends, that you know we should go to that shopping center, to the food court, and choose different types of restaurants and just meet in the middle and eat. You know, I wanted to suggest that, but I didn't know so many of those words. So instead, all I said was, "En esa casa hay mucha comida," which basically means there's a lot of food in that house. You know. And this is it's the most primitive way how to explain, how to express that idea, but it worked because they were discussing like, oh, we're hungry, where do we go and eat? And I just wanted to say, no, there's a lot of restaurants, you know, to choose from in that house. And of course they laughed about it, like it was a very simple way to say, but my Spanish was like A2. So I was happy that I actually expressed something in general. And I think this is the key. Like in Swahili the other day, I was telling my Swahili teacher, Handy, explaining something about a mortgage. You know, I don't know how to say mortgage in Swahili, like one level. And I said, you know, I want to buy a flat. I need a lot of money for a flat. I don't have enough money. I need to get money from someone. You know, the someone is a bank, etc. And we got to the concept of a mortgage. So you can actually talk about almost anything with very, very simple expressions. The whole mindset, again, is just to simplify it to the biggest way possible.
Yeah, learning to paraphrase, right? Learning to work your way around any obstacle.
Right.
And ultimately, I guess, you know, the main thing with speaking is that if you want to learn to speak, if you want to get good at speaking, what's the one thing you actually have to do?
speak a lot. Like, there's really no way around it. There's no shortcut in this. It's just a lot of speaking practice, that's all.
All right, so we've covered self-talk, we've covered output, we've covered mistakes, we've covered what to talk about, we've covered simplification, and then the importance of actually speaking. Golden stuff. We've got one more part to this discussion, part 5, and we're going to be talking about how to take everything that we've covered so far and actually take that off into the distant future, so you can actually continue your learning beyond, for the duration. So
to keep it long term, right?
To the long term, yeah. So join us back for part 5 of this. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe. If not, that's fine. Leave us a comment instead. Do something. Click the thumbs up or the thumbs down. You know what to do. And we'll see you back very soon for part 5.
See you there.